All right. So welcome to tonight's webinar. Like I said, my name is Joyce Trost, and I'm going to be your host for this evening. I am the director of the registries at the CP Research Network, and I'm excited to host this very important new research direction to be shared by our speakers tonight, Dr. Corinna Bauer, Dr. Bauer Harpster, and CP Research Network co-founder Michele Shusterman. Our MyCP webinar series is how we engage with the community in research to get your input and to help you understand the research, the network's research objectives. So first, I'm going to give you just like a 10-minute introduction to the work of the CP Research Network before we turn the slides and the microphone over to our presenters. For those of you who have heard Paul give this introduction before, I will be including some updated information and some new information tonight, so just wanted to let you know that. And then after the CBI presentation, there will be an open question and answer session. So the CP Research Network was born out of an NIH meeting that our co-founders attended in 2014. And that meeting concluded that there were several important initiatives that needed to happen to improve the state of the science and treatment for cerebral palsy. First was the need for a national registry to capture patient characteristics, interventions, and outcomes for people with CP. Second was the need for more comparative effectiveness research, given the multitude of interventions that exist for people with CP. And this image of the yellow and green bubbles is from Dr. Iona Novak's famous stoplights paper, which was published in 2020. And for many of these interventions, it's critical that we compare them within different populations to see what is most effective for each population. A third objective of that meeting was to increase the study of adults, given that most people in the United States living with cerebral palsy are adults, and that most of the research is currently focused on children. The fourth objective was to plan basic and translational research agenda to discover new treatments and preventions for CP. And the fifth was to grow the field of researchers working in the area of cerebral palsy. And finally, the conference summary noted the importance of engaging families in this journey and engaging them in the research for cerebral palsy. So the CP Research Network was founded in 2015, shortly after that seminal NIH meeting, with a mission to optimize the life and health and wellness of people with cerebral palsy and their families through high-quality research, education, and community programming. Pictured here are the group of 45 people that we brought together in Chicago in 2017 to set a patient-centered research agenda called Research CP. And the network has 4 pillars that it focuses on. On the top left, you can see a set of our researchers gathered in Michigan in 2019, and that stands for the pillar of research and quality improvement. In the bottom left, you can see a sample of our online print and educational materials. And in the bottom right, you see the photograph emphasizing how we engage with the community. And finally, on the top right, you see a symbol of our focus on health and well-being programs. Here you can see our vision, and I'm just going to summarize it while you read to say that we are an engaged community of stakeholders and health systems that have created a learning health network that is and will be focused on improving health and well-being in ways that matter to individuals with cerebral palsy. Since the network was founded, we've made great progress on the 3 pillars of education, research, and wellness. On the education front, we launched the CP Toolkit from Diagnosis to Understanding in 2015, and it has been distributed to many hospitals and downloaded by more than 5,800 people. We went on to release the Well-Being Guide for Caregivers in 2017, which has been translated into both Spanish and Portuguese. And we launched MyCP in 2020, including its ability to do web personalization of the rich set of resources available on our website. We conduct monthly webinars like this one to engage the community. On the research front, we launched our clinical registry in 2016, which now has more than 10,000 patients in it. The community registry, which was launched in March of 2019, now has more than 2,500 people. We published our patient-centered research agenda back in 2018, and then there was an additional research agenda for dystonia published in 2020. We've gone on to have significant funding milestones, both from the National Institute of Health and by forming a partnership with the largest private funder of cerebral palsy research in the United States, the CP Alliance Research Foundation, otherwise known as CPARF. In addition, we've launched 5 quality improvement initiatives, and we're academically focused with our work and have had 13 publications and more than 39 academic presentations. We currently have 5 manuscripts under development, and our registry is now becoming a source of multiple analyses to move the field forward. Our wellness program has blossomed under our partnership with the National Center for Health, Physical Activity, and Disability, where we refer adults to a well-being program called Mentor. We are also working with NCPAD to develop pediatric offerings. So these 2 graphs begin to give you a sense of some of the scale and the power of our clinical registry. So on the left, you can see a graph of the Gross Motor Functional Classification System, or GMFCS. This is a key measure of how people move about in the community. So you can see here the distribution of level 1, where individuals walk without a walker, to level 5, where individuals are primarily using wheelchair for their mobility. On the right, you can see a graph of the age distribution of the people in the registry. And it is interesting to note that approximately 25% of our clinical registry participants are adults. By contrast, these 2 graphs are from our community registry. So you can see that the GMFCS distribution is quite different from the clinical registry. And this really reflects the differences in participants of those people who are seeking information and support research online versus those who are seeking out care in our hospital networks and clinics. Similarly, you'll see the graph on the right, the majority of participants in our community registry are adults.
Want a treat? You want a treat?
Like I mentioned before, we are a 32-center learning health network, which is spread across the United States. Here's a map of all of the network members. The green pins represent sites that are actively collecting data into the registry. The green circles around them are the lifespan centers that see adults. And the blue pins represent sites that have raised their hand and have said they want to join the Cerebral Palsy Research Network, but have not yet signed their participation agreements. So just a little bit about our research strategy. Our research strategy is to stimulate the research ecosystem to, quote unquote, let 1,000 flowers bloom and help those flowers grow into funded grants. So we've taken steps to set a patient-centered research agenda I talked a little bit about before, to build an infrastructure that will take advantage of researchers in cerebral palsy, to balance between generating new evidence and improving outcomes through quality improvement, using our registry to monitor and implement evidence-based medicine and outcomes for the cerebral palsy population. So this slide shows a representation of all the steps that it takes to move a study through the pipeline to advance research. So we have now a well-defined process by which concepts can move through to applications, to study execution, to manuscripts. So I'm going to show you an animation of how this has worked over the years that the CP research that the CP Research Network has been building research projects. So the green ovals are going to represent active quality improvement work, and the white circles will represent research studies. Okay, so here you can see in 2015, 2016, 2017, 2018, 2019, 2020, 2021, 22, 23, lots of new projects, and now in 2024. So as you can see, we have a rich study pipeline with lots of activity from concept to application, to execution, to publication of the evidence. So in summary, the CP Research Network adds unique value to stimulate research for cerebral palsy. It provides a platform for sustained research and quality improvement that can study long-term outcomes in our population. It fundamentally implements a learning health network that uses data from the care of patients at the site that they are in the network to continuously improve the care of people with cerebral palsy and their outcomes. Right, that's all I have for this evening for the presentation. And now I am going to hand it over to our speakers for this evening, Dr. Corinna Bauer, Dr. Bauer Harpster, and Michele Shusterman. Okay, let me.
Is
it okay to share my screen now?
Yeah, you should be able to share.
Oh, it says you cannot start screen share. Oh, while you're sharing. So if you unshare, then I should be able to share.
Oh, let's see here. I thought I had unshared.
Thank you.
Okay, see. Okay, see if you can share now.
Let's see. Can you guys see that okay?
That worked.
Okay. So Corinna's going to start us off.
Okay. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yep.
I was joined earlier and then my computer decided to stop working with my phone and my computer. So showed it.
I think we have somebody that needs to mute. A couple of you need to mute. Thank you.
First of all, thank you to Paul and to Joyce and the rest of the team for inviting myself, Karen, and Michele to speak to you guys about our upcoming research study involving cerebral visual impairment and cerebral palsy. We're really excited to be able to hopefully utilize the MyCP resource to investigate how vision is impacted in individuals with cerebral palsy across the lifespan. I think one of the things that Dr. Trost mentioned earlier in her introduction that really sort of struck me was how, although most of the people in the United States who are living with cerebral palsy are adults, that most of the research is currently being conducted in children. And the same is true of CVI, where most of the research is currently being done on children. And so we're hoping to sort of start to change that. Okay, slide please.
Not advancing. Hang on one second. Let me try a different way. Okay.
Okay, perfect. So what we hope the take-home points from today are that we hope that you guys will be able to come away with a better understanding about what cerebral visual impairment, or CVI, is, and how it might manifest itself in individuals with cerebral palsy. We're going to discuss a little bit about the state of the evidence for CVI and review what the evidence is for interventions, keeping in mind that most of this evidence has been conducted in children. And then Michele has also graciously agreed to provide a parent perspective of caring for a youth with CVI. So excited to share this with you. So for those of you who aren't aware, CVI, or cortical or cerebral or central visual impairment, I don't know what you all choose to call it, but we prefer cerebral. It is a verifiable visual dysfunction or set of visual dysfunctions that cannot be attributed to disorders of the anterior visual pathways or any potentially co-occurring ocular impairment. So you might be wondering, well, what does that mean? Well, really, it's essentially challenges seeing and interpreting your visual environment because of something in the brain and not because of something in your eye. So how this might manifest really depends on the person, as we'll see in a couple of slides, but it could impact things like visual acuity and visual fields. It can also impact higher visual perceptual abilities. As you can imagine, ultimately CVI then, when these visual perceptual challenges can impact a lot of different aspects of one's life, including if you're a child or someone in school, access to your education materials and learning. If you're in the work environment, maybe access to your working materials can influence lots of different things, including independence and potentially overall quality of life. The numbers for CVI are still sort of in the works in the literature, but recent evidence suggests that it is the foremost individual cause of pediatric visual impairment in many countries around the world. And that individuals with cerebral palsy are at an increased risk for CVI due to shared neural or brain-based mechanisms. So a recent study by Kathy Williams and colleagues out of the UK, they looked at the number of CVI-related visual behaviors in children in elementary schools. So it is in both mainstream elementary school as well as what they call in the UK special schools. And they found that in the usual school environment, about 3% of kids demonstrated CVI-related vision problems, whereas in these special schools, whereby these children often required, additional services, but about 50% of those children also had CVI-related vision problems. So this is something that, for those of us in the CP and early developmental condition framework need to be aware of. So what is CVI, other than these verifiable visual dysfunctions, and how might it manifest? Slide, please. So as I mentioned, this is because of injury or damage or malformation of the brain structures involved with visual perception. And this has a varying presentation in individuals. So in some kids and individuals with CVI, next slide. Depending on the individual themselves, sometimes these visual impairments might not necessarily be recognized, specifically due to the external observer. Oftentimes, not every disability is visible, and visual impairments are one of those things in particular. Evidence from the literature and from those doing research, it indicates that the extent and location of the brain injury or the damage is not just highly variable, but also is sort of difficult then to predict what the outcome and the recovery potential might be in terms of visual functions. And so that also in turn makes it difficult to have individualized intervention plans, particularly when comorbidities include cognitive challenges or speech and motor challenges as well. So why might we all care about CBI? Well, as I mentioned, it is one of the leading causes of childhood visual impairment in many nations around the world. And also, when you look in adults who've had brain injury, this is also a common occurrence following brain injury in adults. Many survivors of stroke and traumatic brain injury also present with challenges with visual processing and visual functions, which are reported in the literature, but unfortunately not often evaluated in the clinic. So as such, it's very likely that CBI is unrecognized, poorly characterized, and difficult to quantify, and so potentially is underdiagnosed. Because of this, it's likely that those with CBI represent an underserved population for a variety of different reasons. And because of this, that means that many individuals might not be getting the services that they need, either because they're not aware that they require the services and could benefit from them, or because they're not being evaluated. And because they're not being evaluated, then we don't know how, what needs to be addressed. So what are some of the visual challenges and manifestations of CBI? So there are three main categories which have been sort of reported throughout the literature through the work of Marinka Steindem, Gordon Dutton, Amanda Lewis, Christine Roman, and many, many others around the world. So there are challenges with visual function. And by that, I mean the things that you usually get tested when you go to see your eye care professional. So things like reduced visual acuity, restricted visual fields where you might not see a full spectrum of the visual field, but it might be restricted. And also challenges with contrast sensitivity and so on and so forth, as well as mid-level visual perceptual processes. So when I talk about mid-level visual perception, this is sort of like perceptual grouping, understanding that these contours, hypothetical situation, represent the outline of an object. Figure ground segmentation, so being able to segment my body in the speaker video from my blurry background of like my shoes and my purses and stuff that are behind me in my office, and those sorts of things. But really, when we also talk about CBI, oftentimes it's these visual perceptual challenges which can really impact an individual's activities of daily living. So challenges with visual attention, being able to find something when you're visually scanning the environment, difficulty with visual spatial processes, motion processing, complexity and crowding, visual motor integration, face and object recognition, which is something that we're increasingly becoming aware of, and many other potential challenges with visual perception. So the causes of cerebral visual impairment are very similar to those of cerebral palsy. Hypoxic ischemic events, strokes, seizure activity, traumatic brain injury, genetic disorders, premature birth, so on and so forth. And we sort of created this hypothetical horizontal line here between brain, supposed to be under brain tumors, whereby the top 5 items on this list are things that can impact and sort of manifest and start in adulthood, and so or in childhood. So I think it's also important to recognize that CBI is not just a condition related to childhood onset, but that it can also have an onset in adulthood. But we're not entirely certain yet how that impacts assessment, how it impacts recovery, and how it impacts how we manage the condition. So, okay, so you might be wondering, well, why are you making all this fuss about the CBI and vision? Well, there are a number of different reasons for this. Vision is not just a dominant sense, but there are very few activities that we do throughout the day that do not involve vision to some extent. It is integrated with many different sensory modalities, and it can impact a lot of different domains, including fine and gross motor skills. And so I think it's important to think about vision, particularly for those of us who are involved with education and rehabilitation strategies, to think about how is vision potentially impacting the efficacy of the interventions. How is this individual on their caseload or in my family using their vision? And what challenges might they be having with their vision, and how can we address that? So there are a number of different challenges which Karen is going to talk about next. And one of the challenges that we're facing as a field is the current lack of consensus in a number of different things, such as criteria for diagnosis. And there are efforts ongoing both here in the US as well as abroad in Europe, aiming to look at the evidence for this. Early detection, what are the screening tools? I talked about this with a lot of you guys at the investigator meeting. How can we detect this early? How do we assess it? What are the outcomes and how do we measure it? And how do we intervene? And also, how do we call it? So I'm going to turn it over to Karen, and she's going to talk more about these things.
First, let me apologize for the crazy sporadic screen changes. It keeps going crazy on me, so I apologize for that. So first, I'll start to talk about early screening for CVI. So like Corinna mentioned, vision is going to impact so many aspects of development. So for young babies who may or may not have CVI, there are questionnaires that are available that their caregivers can fill out, and for adults that they could fill out for themselves if they think that their CVI might be a possibility. Any person who has a positive screening should then go get a more in-depth vision assessment. And what that usually entails is what we call visual function, so how the eyes work, and functional vision, how the brain is processing what the eyes are seeing. There are many CVI questionnaires, but I just put a couple here to talk about. The first one is the pre-VS, or the pre-verbal visual assessment. That's for the youngest kids, for babies 24 months and younger. And the rest of the questionnaires here can be used for people who are 2 years or older. Some of them start at 4, some of them start a little bit later. But there are different lengths of questionnaires. That the next one is the Dutton 5 questionnaires. Is just a quick screener to see if CVI is something that should be considered. The CVI questionnaire, the measurement of early vision use that's specifically for people with cerebral palsy, and the insight inventory. The incidence of vision problems in CP might be 3 times as more likely to have a vision impairment than those in the general public. And the incidence varies depending on which research article you read, but up to 87% of individuals with CP may have some kind of co-occurring visual perceptual dysfunction. Vision problems are underreported, like Corinna mentioned earlier, and under-referred for eye exams, especially if the cerebral palsy is mild. There are also several studies that show correlations between the severity of CP and the severity of vision loss. And like we mentioned earlier, the entire visual system is at risk for damage, and a lot of the brain is processing vision information. So the research and clinical goals for children with CVI, I apologize, I say children because I work at a children's hospital, but really for individuals with CVI, is that we want to identify it early. I'll talk about some interventions in a couple slides, but we do know that if we can find CVI early, we get a diagnosis and then get referred for services that are specific to individuals with CVI. We want to refer for functional vision, regardless of complications or comorbidities. We understand that what a child sees and how they use their vision to structure communication, information in the environment is very important. So for some children or some individuals, their vision may seem different in some place like a Target versus in their home. Usually it's easier for children to see things in places that they're more familiar with versus in external environments outside the home. And then the other thing is we want to accurately characterize visual dysfunction to inform evidence-based early intervention strategies. We want to make sure that the child can enhance their learning, their daily living skills, social skills, and mobility skills. The majority of the institutions that treat children or individuals with CVI take a multidisciplinary approach to care. What that means is there's a team approach, usually an ophthalmologist, an occupational therapist, a teacher of students with visual impairment, and orientation and mobility specialists all work together to figure out the best plan of care for the individual with CVI. That will include a comprehensive evaluation, diagnosis, and then referral for evidence-based interventions. And the whole goal of that is to maximize independence in everyday lives. So I'll speak about some interventions that have been shown in the literature for CVI. There are not very many of them. And one thing to think about when we're thinking about interventions is there are a lot of different factors that are going to contribute to how an individual uses their vision. So the environment is going to play a huge piece of it, their motor skills, the way that they're positioned, if they have glasses, if they're tired. So all of these things are going to impact the way a person uses their vision. This is a scoping review that was published about 2 years ago. There are 23 interventions that were shown in the literature for children with CVI. In these studies, it ranged from babies 1 month of age up to 17 years of age. And the sample size really varied from 1 person in the study to 388 people. If you can see the slide here, there are 6 categories of interventions. Visual stimulation and visual skills training. Most studies were on task adaptations and environmental modifications. Stem cell transplantation, acupuncture, and transcranial electric stimulation. Of all these studies, there were only 3 randomized control trials. So that means that there was an intervention that was compared to another control group. That just tells us that the state of the evidence is not where we want it to be. We need to see higher level studies with control groups so that we can understand if the intervention is effective. The other study I wanted to mention is there was a focus group run by Pilling and colleagues, and they talked to parents of children with CVI, and they came up with these 3-word phrases of environmental strategies that were helpful for their children with CVI. So some of them might be clearing the clutter, so reducing the complexity of the environment, using bright colors, putting just one thing out there at a time to make it easier to see, keeping things still, keeping things short. It's a great article if you haven't seen this one, but lots of strategies that were mentioned by parents to help children with CVI. So the next thing we'll talk about is the proposed study that Corinna and Michele and I and Nicola McDowell are proposing to do, where it's called the prevalence of visual impairments in individuals with cerebral palsy across the lifespan. So the goal of the study is to understand the prevalence of visual impairment in individuals with CVI. We want to know how vision and visual perception impacts individuals with CP across the lifespan, how challenges with vision impacts the quality of life for those with CP and or their caregivers. And the way that we're going to do this is we're going to collect questionnaires starting with the CPRN registry. Why it's important is we don't know how vision impacts individuals with CP across the lifespan. As Corinna mentioned earlier today, we know more about how it impacts children with CVI, we know a lot less about how it impacts teenagers and adults with CVI. If vision isn't evaluated and identified as being impaired, it won't be able to be included in rehabilitation, education, work goals, things like that. And we know that vision can impair activities of daily living beyond just motor skills alone. And then it supports the CVI initiatives with both the National Eye Institute and NINDS. Okay, so now we're going to pass it over to Michele. We have a couple questions for Michele. And the first one, Michele, was we wanted to know, at what age did you first suspect vision difficulties, and what were your concerns when you had those suspicions?
Okay, well, the first thing I want to share is that my daughter Lily is now 17. And at the time that we suspected she was having problems with her vision, she was about 6 years old. And she was already being treated for ocular impairments. So those issues that come about that relate to how the eye itself is working rather than how the information is interpreted when it gets to the brain. And I'd been fortunate enough, I was at a professional conference, and it was AACPDM, and there was a person speaking that I didn't know about, and another parent said that I should go and listen to her speak. And I did it, I thought at the time, on behalf of the community, just to get information about this condition, CVI. And so as I sat and listened to her, I actually started to cry because I realized my own daughter had many of the symptoms of this condition that she was discussing. So at that time, there was very little about the field that was organized, at least for a parent, and I think for eye professionals as well. So it was Dr. Roman, who was speaking at this AACPDM meeting, and she helped me quite a bit. I interviewed her extensively to get information about what CVI, what she observed CVI was, and what she felt was working to help people. So it wasn't by any means this extensive, I guess, array of information. It was really about me putting together different ideas about how to help my daughter and how to share this information with our community.
Okay, so it sounds like you learned about it when she was 6, and then about how old do you remember when she was diagnosed, and who gave her that diagnosis?
So we have a local developmental optometrist, and the work that this optometrist has been doing for years, it intersects CVI. It's not the same thing, but it was a big help to us. And it was what we had to work with, was me reading and talking to this developmental optometrist who was spending hours with my daughter. And it was, she really wasn't given a formal diagnosis at the time because nobody knew what that meant. How do you give a diagnosis? How do you do an assessment? But we surely had a lot of information because I realized why my daughter couldn't recognize people. She has phase blindness. And she was having trouble riding her adaptive trike. She couldn't figure out which side of the road was like, she couldn't decipher the center from the outside, like left and right areas. And we just used, actually, I think it was a lot of what was shared in that, I don't know if it was an article you said or a book about different interventions that parents had observed as working.
Mm-hmm. It was an article. Yeah.
Okay, article. So we just tried these different ways of helping her isolate visual information so that it was not confusing and she could begin to isolate objects.
Okay. And then if you had to think about it, what was your biggest challenge raising a child with CVI?
I think the biggest challenge has been that this was something that I wasn't looking for. It was something we discovered, and it was by serendipity, but it wasn't good serendipity. I mean, on the one hand, thank God we found out sooner rather than later, because my daughter's vision is probably the most challenging aspect of her day, and has been the most challenging aspect of her development. And I think when you are a parent, you know so much about your child, you can bring information about how your child moves, and those observations can help an eye professional get a sense of what might be going on.
Okay. Anything else that you want to tell any parents or individuals with CVI?
You know, I had to become a very strong advocate because the field was not really pronounced in a way that it wasn't really recognized CVI. So I had to put I had to come up with language that would appease the administrators that were looking over my daughter's educational plan. And I had to point out that, you know, this is the single most difficult area for her as far as learning goes. And her vision has improved. I don't know that we have a way of documenting that, but you know, she has over time developed more skills and things have become easier for her. And I don't want parents to feel like there isn't any hope. I think that there's a lot of possibility in this field, but it takes patience.
Thank you. Now we'll open it up for questions. I see some, oh, telling you, this thing has a mind of its own.
There is one question in the chat. The question says, do you think it's possible that 3% of children who present with CVI characteristics could be related to an undiagnosed neurodevelopmental diagnosis?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So I think that the overall premise of the question is it possible that in those children in a typical classroom who had CVI related behaviors, whether or not that was actually due to CVI or some underlying neurodevelopmental condition? That's how I am understanding the question. Please type in the chat if I misunderstand that. And that's a great question. And I think in this study by Kathy Williams and her colleagues, it wasn't necessarily a diagnosis of CVI, but it was that these children in the classroom had CVI related behaviors. So they didn't have a chance to actually go through the whole battery of, a full clinical workup to see whether or not there was actually a diagnosis, but saying that at least one child in every classroom has challenges with the visual perceptual abilities that might be picked up by one of these screeners, indicating that they should then be referred on to potentially additional evaluations. However, that being said, in the literature specific for those actually with the diagnosis of CVI, there are a number of co-occurring conditions as well as potential differential diagnoses that the field is currently working through trying to figure out at what point do they overlap, at what point are they separated, so on and so forth. So I don't know if that answered your question or not. Oftentimes it's difficult to disentangle, but
there are other questions. You can write them in the chat. You can physically raise your hand or raise your hand via Zoom. I'll try to pick up on the questions that are coming in. The next question is, what advice would you give an adult that thinks they might have CVI?
I would recommend a vision evaluation to start with. It's tricky because there are not a lot of adult ophthalmologists that specialize in CVI. So I think maybe asking around for the right provider, if anybody has, wherever you're at, to see if anybody has that specialty. But I do think that an eye exam would be helpful, as well as, filling out, there are some behavioral questionnaires. So like that you might be able to read some of the behaviors that are common in individuals with CVI and see if you might score in the concern area.
Harriet, it's nice to see you on the call. And we chatted about this briefly at the investigator meeting. I think of the questionnaires that Karen had mentioned earlier, the Insight inventory, there is a version that has been recently sort of developed or tweaked a little bit for use in adults. And we can, CVI Scotland has some great resources about that. Alamazal also, I can't remember if you're located in the Northeast or not, but NECO, the New England Cultural Optometry, is an excellent resource also for looking at evaluations across all ages. But yeah, I would recommend that you look at the CBI Scotland website. They do have the insight inventory for adults, as well as a link towards some potential ways that you might be able to modify the environment, or some different things to sort of help you, go about daily activities. So feel free to email us also too if you have specific questions.
Great, thank you.
Looks like LaWanda has a question, has her hand raised. LaWanda, you want to ask your question? I can't hear you. All right, well, while we're waiting for get that figured out, let's go ahead and, Corinna, can you see the chat? Do you want to?
I can see the chat, yeah. So it looks like
Courtney would be
yeah,
next.
Yeah, Courtney is asking about, Karen, this might be one for you. Interventions with vestibular considerations. Are you aware of any upcoming studies that consider this, specifically to enhance success with CBI strategies and interventions?
Yeah, I do not know of any studies that are incorporating vestibular function, but I do think that would be something for sure to look at. But I don't know of any vestibular studies that are happening at the time.
Yeah, I'm also not aware of anything at the moment, but we can keep you posted. Aiden is asking too about differential diagnosis, even with nystagmus. And I do, so far as I'm aware, Karen, a diagnosis of nystagmus where your eyes kind of, flicker back and forth, doesn't preclude a CBI evaluation or even a diagnosis of CBI. Oftentimes the two do co-occur.
I would agree with that.
Colleen Murray is asking if binocular visual dysfunction is different from or a form of CBI. Colleen, if you're on the phone, can you clarify a little bit what you mean by binocular visual dysfunction? We'll put it in the chat just so we can answer appropriately.
Hi, yeah, so we work pretty closely with a neuro-ophthalmologist here who specializes in, to me, is known as binocular vision dysfunction. Basically, let the two eyes, they aren't working together. So I know there's like a bunch of other different diagnoses within that, but she doesn't, I guess I'm trying to better understand like CVI, because I have one kiddo and she doesn't use the term CVI, so I just didn't know if you guys had any insight into that, or because she specializes with our kids who are nonverbal, and uses a lot of like prisms in the glasses or her visual fields and stuff like that. So then we incorporate it into our physical therapy.
Can I answer that as a parent?
Yeah.
So I found that it was really confusing to make sense of what everyone was wanting to do and tried to do with my daughter. And so I just focused on what was working. So what interventions did we try that seemed to produce a successful result? And that really made everything that was confusing fall away most of the time. Because some of the scientific distinction in what we're discussing may not be sorted out for a while. And that's been my view as a parent. But I don't want to wait for that to happen.
Yeah, no, I agree with that.
Okay. Cindy commented that she works closely with the PT and a teacher of students with visual impairment and an orientation and mobility specialist, and they work a lot with each other. and learn from each other. And I would agree, we have at Cincinnati Children's, we also have a very similar team, and we do all of our evaluations together and help each other with treatment plans and kind of bounce ideas off of each other. So if you have that kind of situation, I think it's really helpful. The next question, can you speak to the use of a CVI rating scale? Parents focus on numbers or scores and really want their child to progress up a scale. I'm sorry, I can't see that word. And it may not be possible. So this is tricky because right now, there is not really a CVI outcome measure. So to be able to measure progress in something, the assessment has to be developed as an outcome measure and has to be validated as an outcome measure. And to my knowledge, there is not a good outcome measure out there for CVI. And there are people who look at things like visual attention or visual acuity or different things like that. But at the state of the field right now, and you guys can speak to if you know of anything else, at our institution, we use something called the Canadian Occupational Performance Measure, which is an outcome measure, and it is a measure that where we set goals with, and parents rate how their child is doing a goal. So for example, if their goal is for their child to feed themselves, they rate before and after an intervention. And we use that, or we use something called the goal attainment scaling, which is another similar scale that's looks at functional goals. And that's kind of what we use in our institution, but you guys can speak to Corinna and Michele if you've come across any outcome measures for functional vision yet.
Hey, Michele, do you want to go first if you have any experience with this?
The developmental optometrists we've been seeing for many years, even before this term CVI was familiar to us. She had a lot of measures that she was using. I was not familiar with them, and she started to get involved with CVI and assessing her patients for CVI. And I honestly don't know the details of that. She was with my daughter for 3 hours, and we were just kind of worn out after the testing was done, that I didn't have a chance to sit with her optometrist and discuss what she did. But it did come up today. My daughter asked if she was going to be doing some work on her vision this summer.
Yeah, I agree. This is sort of a tricky question to answer, because I think there are a few underlying, things that sort of feed into, how you measure change. And one of them would be, how do you measure that ability in the first place? But I think ultimately the goal is to, whether or not it's using vision or not, is, as I mentioned, to be able to do, activities of daily living, whatever that might be for, for you as an individual, for your child, for your loved one, for your student. And, how can you help them attain that goal? So whether or not it's introducing Braille or an alternative learning media, depending on how you think they might best access their environment, doesn't necessarily have to be visual. I think this is something that's being more and more recognized too, through learning media assessments, and sort of looking at like I'm blanking on the exact term, but essentially, considering the individual as a whole and how that can be used to, sort of help bolster, their access to their environment. There were a few different tools and guides to sort of help identify potential ways to do that. One of them is the CVI planning guide. The Perkins website has some great resources, as does, of course, CVI Scotland, and the University of Ulster also has some great recommendations for how different things might be modified to help gain access to the environment if vision might be impacted. So we can, of course, share these resources with Joyce, and she can pass them on.
It looks like we have time for just one more question. And there was a question that's a little bit different. It asks, can you tell us more about your vision for the research approach to gathering data and the nature of your study? And what is the actual underlying hypothesis?
Oh yeah, this is a great question. So we are hoping to initially utilize the MyCP resource as part of the CPRN. And so I think as a first step, we really want to understand better how is vision impacted or not in individuals with cerebral palsy across the lifespan. As you mentioned, we have really no indication in the literature. I've gone back to the CP literature from like the 60s, and really it focuses a lot on visual acuity and visual fields, but not much else about how vision impacts activities of daily living and participation. And we would really love to get a sense of, how is that impacted across the lifespan for those of you who work, who are transitioning out of work into retirement, and at various different stages across the lifespan. So I don't know if we necessarily have a hypothesis per se yet. I think we're just really looking to gain some insight into how is this impacted, so that then in the future we can figure out, okay, well, how can we best help people across the lifespan. So.
Right. Well, thank you very much, Karen, Michele, and Corinna, for being our presenters tonight, and everybody for the interactive conversation and discussion. This webinar will be posted on YouTube, on the Cerebral Palsy Research Network YouTube channel. Might take a day or two to get there. So have a good night, and thank you very much.
Thank you all for coming.